the study showed safety and efficacy, and that's what we were worried about, then why do I have to keep looking for this potential contaminant that like we have proven over the samples and the data we've collected that isn't there?
That's Morgan Tweet, Executive Director of the Hemp Feed Coalition. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock. And as I promised you last week, on today's show, we're going to dig in a little bit on that letter that the Association of American Feed Control Operators, otherwise known as the AAFCO, the letter that they wrote to ag leaders and state policymakers addressing their concerns over the allowance of hemp in animal feed. At the beginning of the interview, I will review the points of the AAFCO's letter in some detail. And then I'll talk to Morgan Tweet from the Hemp Feed Coalition about their response to the AAFCO's letter. So the whole issue to me underscores the importance of education around hemp and why we shouldn't be lumping cannabinoid hemp in with industrial hemp. Anyway, today I'm going to talk to Morgan about hemp grain and the challenge of getting it approved as a livestock feed, especially in the face of resistance from powerful groups such as the AAFCO. But first, we're going to take a quick sponsor break and then come back with some nuggets of hemp news and then get into our interview. This episode is brought to you in part by Americhon Cast Hemp. Americhon will be hosting not one, but 2 hempcrete workshops this April near Allentown, Pennsylvania. April 2nd through the 5th, and then April 7th through the 10th. Each 4-day hands-on workshop will focus on the spray-applied hempcrete system and hempcrete panels for modular building. Plus, they're going to get into bidding and estimating hempcrete jobs and solid accounting practices to help you keep your hempcrete business running smoothly. Learn more and register for these workshops at americhon.com/training. And don't worry, I'll put that link on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. All right, and here's something to think about. I read about this in the New York Times yesterday. The headline says, in a first, California plans to clean up microplastics. The state has adopted a strategy to monitor and reduce the ubiquitous form of pollution. And then I'm just going to quote from the story here. It says, they are in your gut. They are in the ocean. They are even floating through the air in the most remote regions of the West. Microplastics. Fragments of broken down plastic no larger than a fraction of an inch have become a colossal global problem. And California wants to fix that. Last month, the state became the first in the nation to adopt a strategy addressing the scourge of tiny detritus. We need to eliminate our addiction to single-use plastics, said Mark Gold, the executive director of the Ocean Protection Council, the governmental body that approved the plan. The strategy is not regulatory, but the council has committed to spending $3 million this year, with reduction targets laid out between now and 2030. Gold added, you find microplastics everywhere you look. By some estimates, the story says, humans have manufactured about 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic, only 9% of which has ever been recycled. About 11 million metric tons of this plastic end up in the ocean every year, and without intervention, this number is expected to triple by 2040, according to the council. When these plastics break down, they can be eaten by marine animals, stunting their growth and causing reproductive problems. They have also been found in human organs, including placentas, as well as in soils and plants. So yeah, just something to think about there, as we contemplate our future here on planet Earth. I'm an optimist, though, so I think we can overcome these challenges. This portion of the show is brought to you by IND Hemp. All right, let's get into some nuggets of hemp news for this week of March 9th, 2022. Here, this first story is from westward.com. The headline reads, Hemp Industry Asks Congress for Help with THC Testing Obstacle. The story says that more than 3 years after hemp's federal legalization, the hemp industry is still pushing back against lab testing and harvesting requirements. During this go-round, however, the push is going to Congress. The 2018 Farm Bill legalized industrial hemp farming, but also required farmers to pass THC tests from labs certified by the DEA by 2022. According to the USDA, there are only 2 such labs in Colorado, and some states have 0. Hemp lobbyists and farmers have asked the USDA to lift the DEA requirement, but so far have not been successful. However, the Hemp Advancement Act of 2022 would override the USDA ruling and open hemp testing up for more labs. Introduced by U.S. House Representative Shelley Pingree of Maine, some say the bill would be a great way to provide relief to hemp farmers and product manufacturers. Colorado hemp farmer Nick French, owner of Frangosia Farms and Colorado Hemp Honey, says the harvest and testing rules have created an unneeded struggle for new businesses. He says requiring testing to be conducted in DEA-registered labs is restrictive to many people in several states. I don't think the DEA needs to be involved in this aspect, he says. He's right. We have to stop looking at hemp through the lens of the war on drugs. All right, this next story comes from gophersports.com. The headline says, Hemp named National Rookie of the Year finalist. And the story says that forward Peyton Hemp has been named a finalist for Division I Rookie of the Year, as announced by the Hockey Commissioners Association on Tuesday. Wait a minute, this is not a hemp news nugget. I mean, it is, but it's more of a hockey news nugget. Anyway, congratulations, Peyton Hemp. Here's an interesting opinion piece on the Charleston Gazette-Mail. It's written by somebody named Paige L. Forth, and it says hemp is an alternative to Russian fossil fuels. At up to 8.9 metric tons per acre, the cannabis plant is the most efficient carbon-to-biomass agri-tool available. With that in mind, I was horrified to read that industrial hemp, which exceeds the 0.3% THC limit arbitrarily imposed by the federal law, is being burned. It takes up to 100 days for the plant to absorb that much carbon from the atmosphere. Why are we putting it back in a matter of minutes? At the very least, the state should bury it deep, where the decomposing carbon can be reabsorbed into the ground. The excess THC content, while maybe not ideal for consumables, does not affect the quality of any other products that can be made from hemp, including, but not limited to, biofuels, biodegradable plastic, livestock feed, fabrics, and building materials. Electric cars are marvelous for commuting, shopping trips, and traveling 3 hours at a time, but for large machinery, tractor trailers, freight trains, and those of us who drive until our bladders cry for mercy, hemp diesel is an economic alternative that would not require the entire fleet to be retrofitted. If carbon producers made the investment, they could offset their own carbon production simply by growing enough acreage in hemp. That could include cattlemen, who would not only offset the carbon in their cattle's methane production, but feed their cattle as well. The root system of the cannabis plant is such that it will break up clay soil while adding much-needed organic material. 2 or 3 seasons of hemp growth could improve the most intractable soils, even West Virginia's. If every available acre of fallow land was sown in hemp, how much carbon could be removed from the atmosphere, and how much oil could be produced at the rate of roughly 1 barrel per every 2.5 acres every 100 days? Undoubtedly, enough so we would never miss Russian petroleum products. Okay, I don't know who you are, Paige L. Forth, but I like your style. Here's another story about Shelley Pingree's Hemp Advancement Act of 2022. This one is on modernfarmer.com, and it suggests that not everyone will be happy with this bill. So the beginning of the story explains, what the bill is all about, yada, yada, yada. But here I'm going to get closer to the end of the story. All right, so it says that under this new proposed act, however, other cannabinoids such as Delta-8 would be factored into total THC measurements. While these are minor cannabinoids, they will still add to the total THC present in the plant. So while the THC limit while growing and processing would be allowed to be higher, producers might reach it faster. Some growers say the effort to simplify things is actually more impractical in the long run. The Hemp Advancement Act of 2022 will destroy the hemp market, wrote Texas Hemp Growers, an industry group, on its Facebook page. The group says the change will put many hemp farmers out of business. While the bill has broad support from many industry associations, A representative from the National Hemp Association told media last month that there is some concern about the impact of the THC limit on smokable hemp flower. Pingree agrees that her bill does not address every issue related to hemp, but she says that she's bringing it forward for discussion before the 2023 Farm Bill. She doesn't anticipate much opposition to the act. I have my fingers crossed that there's not a lot of controversy here. And speaking of the National Hemp Association, they have recently reiterated their position on cannabinoids. They say that each cannabinoid product needs to be evaluated fairly based on science. They say that there are several competing opinions and assertions, including by industry lobby groups, that any cannabinoid product deemed an intoxicant is a threat to public health, and this has given the National Hemp Association Board pause to review their position and approach to this segment of the industry. They say that they understand it was never the intent of Congress to legalize components of hemp for intoxicants. In fact, they forcibly argued that hemp was not a gateway drug. However, they acknowledged that the language in the 2018 Farm Bill included extracts and all parts of the plants and naturally occurring, which some have used to develop new products, including intoxicants. The proposal that CBD be allowed in food and beverages would make it nearly impossible for consumers to track how much they are consuming. This could potentially pose an equivalent health and safety risk as someone that intentionally consumes an intoxicating cannabinoid. The real public health risk is not in the cannabinoid itself, whether intoxicating or not, it is in the lack of regulation. NHA reiterates this position due to the recent demonization of certain cannabinoids derived from hemp, which are considered intoxicants. Each cannabinoid product needs to be evaluated individually, fairly, and scientifically based upon its safety profile. So I just read parts of their official statement, and I'll put a link to this along with all of these other news nuggets on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. All right, so let's get into this conversation with Morgan from the Hemp Feed Coalition about the recent AAFCO's letter warning about hemp as a livestock feed. Morgan Tweet from the Hemp Feed Coalition. Welcome back to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, Eric. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, we've got some business to discuss here.
We do.
We'll just jump right in. So last month on February 9th, 2022, the Association of American Feed Control Officials, the AAFCO, issued a joint letter from various feed industry stakeholders addressing their concern over the allowance of hemp in animal feed. They say it's too soon to tell if hemp is safe for farm and ranch animals. They say that more scientific research is needed. They say that state leaders and lawmakers are being asked to circumvent government oversight by considering legislation that will allow the use of hemp in states before research is completed or reviewed by the FDA. I think they're referring to what's happening in Montana and Pennsylvania. And they have three areas of concern. One, animal health and safety. Two, the safety of food from production animals entering the human food chain. And three, the adverse impact on farmers, ranchers, and the animal feed industry. They recommend that groups like the Hemp Feed Coalition work through defined regulatory pathways. So, where do you want to start?
Yeah, it's great to have an opportunity to enlighten our listeners to this, because I think that most people are a little ignorant to the process and who is AAFCO, what is this regulation we're talking about? So it might be good to just start there. So like most people don't know, but we're actually regulating animal feed more strictly than we are human food right now. And so every state Department of Agriculture has someone on staff that is their feed regulator. So they do everything from checking labels to making sure that, if you're claiming 30% protein, you're actually hitting that. They're evaluating new ingredients that come on. And they are the regulating body. They're the one who would send you a cease and desist order if you're not in compliance. And these state departments of ag have come together in a group called AAFCO. And that basically is a committee of sorts that, does this evaluation of ingredients. So you're not relying on one person and, their expertise or their knowledge base to make a decision for a whole state. They really look to this group of experts, which I think is fantastic, right? And then ultimately, AAFCO will send in applications like Hemp Coalition has submitted to FDA CVM. So that's a specific part of the FDA, that Center for Veterinary Medicine, that is specifically targeting animal feed. And they're also a really useful regulatory body because they have toxicologists, nutritionists, experts in their field, veterinarians, so that they can give these, scientific reviews a really thorough overview. So the process that AAFCO alludes to is simply that, right? An ingredient has to be evaluated by these different parties. They recommend policy, though, back to the state, and ultimately the state is the one who makes these decisions. So what happens most of the time is AAFCO kind of gives it a green light or a red light, and most states follow that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also a big deal for manufacturers. So most mills or other feed manufacturers will just look at approved AAFCO ingredients for what they will allow into their facilities. And so it's really important to get that status. And so, this letter was specifically targeting state policymakers because HFC and other hemp industry organizations have expressed some frustration with how slow this process has been going, as well as how they've conflated the ingredients that hemp is possibly being valued for. So what I mean by that is they're in a very broad statement saying, we're worried about hemp, period. But their concerns, and they spell it out in this letter, are about THC and cannabinoid levels, which people who are familiar with the hemp plant know that those ingredients or those compounds are only found in certain ingredients. And so, HFC has been around for almost 5 years, and we have almost specifically targeted grain ingredients. So those ingredients derived from the seed, because we knew this barrier to entry was going to be challenging, right? And so we started with the ingredients that we thought had the most applicable use in animal feed, as well as ease of regulatory mindset. And so we have made it very clear that we are not looking at cannabinoids. We're not asking for cannabinoids to be an approved ingredient.
Yeah. So in the AAFCO's letter, they lump hemp in together, like all together as one thing.
Right.
And I've been, in the hemp space for a few years now, and I know that, that the cannabinoids develop in the flower, in the vegetable material, not in the seeds. And if you're a hemp grain farmer, you're growing for the seeds. So can you talk about how, what is the cannabinoidal content of hemp grain?
So HFC in our first application, which was hemp seed meal, which hemp seed meal is the extruded product or byproduct when we were trying to mechanically extract the oil. And so that hemp seed meal product was used for a feed for laying hens. And so that's another part of the process, is every application has to be specific for each ingredient and for each species. So I couldn't have just written an ingredient for hemp seed and all of its derivatives for all poultry. It had to be hemp seed meal for laying hens. And so that's another kind of argument of frustration from the industry, is if we continue down this path, we're talking, millions of dollars and decades before we have, really an open market to compete in.
Because you would have to get like broilers tested and the laying hens and all of these different like subcategories of each species, right?
Exactly. We talk about ruminants, right? That could easily be, we could look at several different species if we classified ruminants together, but they're not willing to look at that right now. They look at dairy cows, and then they look at beef cows, and then they look at calf-cow pairs. And I understand that they're all like different operations, right, of what the target products are off of those animals. But when we're talking about safety and efficacy, especially with an ingredient like hemp seed meal, this is a protein supplement. I'm not trying to apply for a drug. It's not even a vitamin, right? This is just a protein supplement. And so that's really what we're asking, is that we're evaluated against that framework of a protein supplement. But back to your question about what cannabinoids are there in hemp seed meal or hemp seed products. So, like you talked about, physiologically, the plant does not produce these compounds in the seed. Now, you can find levels of cannabinoids on the seed through, we call contamination of the cleaning process. And so
it's on the outside of the seed?
Right. Yeah. So
Okay.
if you have flower material, because almost all cannabis plants, right, have some level of cannabinoids in their flower material. And so if you don't clean the seed well enough, right, you just run dirty grain through a press, like you're probably going to get some of those cannabinoids to transfer into those products. And so in the application process, you describe the manufacturing practices that go along with this ingredient. So we weren't applying for just hemp seed meal, however, whenever you want to make it. We were very specific. It has to go through these processes. It has to be cleaned. And then ultimately we had to recommend a contaminant table. So just like we monitor for like lead and mercury, aflatoxins, other things that most people look for in their feed, we had to come up with a contaminant level for cannabinoids, which we went back and forth with quite a bit, because the idea of contaminant really kind of has just like a bitter taste in your mouth.
Negative connotation.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily what we're trying to do, but the concept really is cannabinoids are not supposed to be found here. So if they are found, then they are considered a contaminant. So, just want to make sure that your listeners understand that we're not against cannabinoids, but
Sure.
They aren't supposed to be here, so we have to test for them. And so we scoured the nation, asked for people to send in samples. We did samples ourselves, sent them in for very discrete analysis through our third-party laboratory. And so we went through that process, and we couldn't find cannabinoids. Now, there's different levels of detection being used across different laboratories, and so there is some variation of that. But down to the lowest that we were testing was 25 parts per million LOQ. We couldn't find it. And so what we initially submitted was that threshold of 25 parts per million. And unfortunately, the kickback we got was, well, go look harder. And it's kind of one of those, I actually had a story with someone the other day who was talking about, well, bring me a rock. You bring them a rock and say, well, bring me another one. I wanted a different one. And that's kind of how we feel like FDA is pushing back on us, is they really haven't given us clarity. The study, just so you know, like the study that was using this hemp seed meal that was tested at 25 parts per million LOQ, no cannabinoids were tested at that level. There were no adverse effects to the chicken. There was no adverse effect to the egg. If anything, there was nutritional benefits to both the chicken and the egg. And so that's where, in my opinion, obviously I'm not a toxicologist or a veterinarian, but if the study showed safety and efficacy, and that's what we were worried about, then why do I have to keep looking for this potential contaminant that like we have proven over the samples and the data we've collected that isn't there?
Right. Like how far do they want you to go? Like parts per billion now, or like how tiny do they want you to look?
Yeah, and that's been on a couple of calls and they didn't give us the answer, right? And so that's another frustrating thing. It's just, okay, well, I guess we'll try again.
And then you try again and you submit it, and then they're going to come back and say, no, not that rock. I want a different rock.
Exactly. Yeah. So we did. We worked with our third-party lab and we resampled. They had to do a whole nother method validation because this wasn't capable in their laboratory at the time. So we have tested down to lower levels of LOQs. We're waiting on those results now, but I'm very confident that, like, I know they're going to be below 25, right? But it's back to from FDA's perspective. I kind of get the impression, and they've almost said it word for word, is until there is a safety study proving allowable daily limits for cannabinoids in humans, they take a zero tolerance policy. And that's not realistic. It's not logical. It's not founded in science. And that's where, from HFC and the industry as a whole, that's our frustration.
It might be good to point out now that hemp as a food ingredient for humans has been regarded as what's generally regarded as safe, right, by the FDA, and that's been that way for years, right? So it's safe for humans to eat. You can feed it to your kids, but now they're concerned about what did they say? The animal health and safety of food from production animals entering the human food chain. But we already know that it's okay to be in the human food chain. So what is going on here?
Yeah. And so, 2018, Fresh Hemp Foods submitted a GRAS application for, these hemp seed products that I'm talking about. And you're absolutely right. They had no concerns from these GRAS applications. And they do call out in these applications a level of allowable THC, because in 2018, cannabinoids were still kind of new and really wasn't on FDA's radar. And so, they recommended at less than 10 part per million THC limit, which equally, that's what we recommended in our ingredient be the contaminant level. We've never seen any levels of THC in our ingredients, so I'm not concerned that, we're at risk to even cross that threshold. But we put it on the label, right? They want to have a metric to measure ingredients against for safety. Totally get that. But we've established and we recommend what those limits should be. And I don't have any data to disprove the safety or efficacy at those limits. So I'm having a hard time understanding what the problem is.
Is there like some other reason they're putting up this much resistance? Like, I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, but are there some like other industries that are being threatened by hemp grain? Like what's the deal here? It makes no sense to me why they're putting up this much resistance.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't personally think that it's, coming from a different like lobbying group or whatnot, just because we are so small, right? Like there's no way I can make any impact on any feed, current manufacturer right now. There's like, I would not make a dent, right? And I say collectively, as in the industry, like we're so small. I do think, and this is just a personal opinion, I do think it's a degree of relevancy. I think that FDA, CBM kind of wants to flex their authority a little bit. It's a little frustrating because we just last year got the notice from Charlotte's Web application about CBD levels and Epidiolex, kind of setting the stage that they're evaluating this against a drug, even though those are two completely different concentrations. And so I feel like it's a little bit of just them wanting to stay relevant and wanting them to have control. And the fact of the matter is that ship has sailed. Those products are already on the store shelf. And I'm not advocating for this, but quite frankly, if they start sending out cease and desist letters and start pulling products off the shelf, they will have a consumer outrage, right? And so I get the impression they're kind of walking the line of wanting to stay relevant and not wanting to piss a bunch of people off. And so they're putting their flag in the livestock feed application. That's where they're going to make their last stand.
Right. That was my next question. Does this come down to an existential crisis for the AAFCO? Because if you are sort of what they say circumventing and going to legislators with these other, I'm not even sure what to call them, but does that make them irrelevant?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And to be clear, in Montana and Pennsylvania, also in all these other states, we're not asking for broad stroke approval, right? In Montana, we called out the species that we did not feel like had any hazard or risk to human consumers, to livestock producers and what their operations and their life, their lifestyle. We're not trying to threaten those things. We called out pets, especially pets and horses. And Montana did a great thing in their plan by excluding, concentrated CBDs or isolated cannabinoid material into that program, because we don't know what's safe, right? And I don't think that we're going to find that it's, crazy limits or whatnot, but the studies do need to take place. I'm absolutely an advocate of that. And your dog is your child, right? I bring my dog into work every day. I would be devastated if I gave him a hemp treat and it did problem. So right. I do think that there definitely is studies that need to be researched and labels that need to be enforced. And that's where FDA, they missed the mark on that. So it's when state policymakers get this letter from AAFCO, I get the impression that there's a little bit of just trying to flex AAFCO's authority, which they don't have authority. They recommend policy. But just trying to stay relevant and to make sure, state policymakers knew that they were there and they were in the middle of it. And so, HFC, we spent a lot of time putting a letter together because I feel like it's our job to educate the states, right? If the feds are going to take so long to get approval and to move these things forward, then the state has the right to try to create a market and create value for their manufacturers and for their farmers. Yeah. And so this is a pathway to do that. And if you feel comfortable and you can look at the data, you can make your own decision, then you don't necessarily have to wait for AAFCO's approval, right?
Right.
So I think we're getting there. Maybe, I don't know. I think that everyone likes to just defer to like, oh, well, when AAFCO approves it, it's great.
30 years later and $600 million. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe it's because it's not a big deal for them. But I think if farmers started going to their Department of Ag and asking, like, hey, why can't I feed this to my cow? We're in a national feed shortage right now. And I have a bin of dirty grain that like is highly nutritious. The cows love it. It has great products. Like, are you going to tell me that I'm not going to be able to feed this? And get a little bit of an uproar from these farmers that really are missing the opportunity. And in some cases, that could be their saving grace.
Yeah, I mean this could jumpstart the industry. Like it would be sort of an injection of a whole lot of energy. And yeah, I was just talking to Montana Senator John Tester in Denver the other day, and I asked him, what he thought of hemp's ability to revitalize small town America. And yeah, he's all for it. He mentioned Fort Benton and the work you're doing there, and you would think more people, the AAFCO, they have farmers' interests at heart, I imagine. Like, it would be just good for the economy if we can sort of get over these hurdles and get to work.
Yeah, and another thing is like, and I'm not asking them to make arbitrary decisions of
Right.
just like my opinion. There's studies out there, right? And we as an industry, maybe we could do a better job of like putting that in front of them. I think that's something I continue to reflect on, like how can we make their job easier? Like what can we do? But the information is out there, right? Like Canada has been doing these studies, Europe has been doing these studies, Australia has been doing these studies. So it's not like we are in this unknown territory of like feeding these animals something that is alien to our planet, right? Like this is something that has been around. And again, we always forget like this was in commerce as a feed material before 1938. So like I think that we should just remember those facts. So when a state policymaker like thinks I'm bullying them into a decision, these are founded ideas. It's not my opinion about the safety and the efficacy of hemp grain products. So that's really what we're trying to say is like let's evaluate these differently. And when you look at hemp grain, let's look at all these other facts that come with it, and let's
Mhm.
make a decision off of those facts.
Right. And it's like they're looking at it through the lens of like the war on drugs, right?
Yeah.
Like,
So it's funny, I know that this kind of goes back to the USDA and not necessarily FDA, but when the DEA made the definition of marijuana, they called out the stalk and the seed material, right? And so if the DEA wasn't concerned about these things, it feels I'm just wondering how we got so concerned and like how this fear mongering of like these ingredients, like how did this stimulate? Because it was evaluated way back then when the DEA made that definition. They weren't concerned about it.
so the AAFCO has a hemp committee, and the Hemp Feed Coalition just this past December asked to be part of that committee, which to me makes sense because you've done a lot of research in there. You've got a vested interest in the development of the industry. And what did they say when you asked to be part of their committee?
Yeah. So it wasn't any secret that AAFCO was, concerned about what was going on the legislative level, that they like were trying to rally the troops essentially to come up, initially with this response letter that we're talking about today, but also, a committee, specifically to address their concerns about hemp. And so when we found out about that, we wrote a really polite letter saying like, we think that's great. You're giving our industry more attention than most ingredients get. You hear the outcry from the consumers. That's awesome. Please let us be a part of that, right? Because like you said, we have the more data, we have more understanding of what the ingredients are. We are, hearing from consumers. And so to me, it makes so much sense that we can be a conduit to help them evaluate these ingredients more quickly. And also for us to take the message back to research of like, what are their concerns? What do we need to find out, right? What is the level of cannabinoids that's acceptable? If we're a part of the conversation, it just makes this a lot more, quicker process. But unfortunately, we were denied that opportunity, and in a very political way, AAFCO just said, "Hey, we're going to keep it to the members we have within AAFCO. Like, we'll be sure to let you know if we have something come up, right? That we can talk to you." And so, obviously, I'm paraphrasing that quite a bit.
Sure.
but the message was kind of heard loud and clear that, we tried to extend an olive branch. We're going to continue to work with them. I'm not saying that we're closing the door by any means. But, they pushed back and we're going to push back a little bit ourselves and just, we feel like we still have every right to be doing what we're doing. And like, we'll continue to support the data, and work with researchers to find out those information. But we're also still going to try to advocate for the farmer and for the industry that like needs these things to move forward. We need the industry to open up. The feed markets are really going to be a game changer for this ingredient. Mm-hmm. So hopefully they, maybe reconsider or invite us to more one-on-one conversations. Because I don't know if you've ever had any experience with, regulators, but it's okay, we'll have a meeting and then I have 120 days to get back to you. Right. So something that could have easily been like a 10-minute conversation that we got through like 10 different bullet points, I have to wait 3 months to get a phone call scheduled with them.
Oh, yeah, so frustrating. Oh, bureaucracy.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about the letters back and forth? Like, what else should listeners know about your position, or what else would you want the AAFCO and everybody else involved to know about hemp as an ingredient or your position on hemp?
I think just like the summary of our letter, kind of the highlights to kind of reiterate to the mm-hmm. listeners. We're talking about grass ingredients, right? We're talking about ingredients that are already approved for human consumption.
Grass, generally recognized as safe.
Correct. Got it. Right. So we're not talking cannabinoids, we're talking seed or grain. Another thing is we're talking about an ingredient that historically was used. And so there's a huge argument that hemp seed products should have already been grandfathered into these approved list of ingredients. And we will continue to share that with legislators and with congressmen, because that really could be an opportunity for us to just one fell swoop, get all of these seed ingredients approved for all the species. And I'm a huge advocate of that. I think that people are going to want to see more data before they really consider that. And we're continuing to do that. But also that what they're asking for is decades of work and millions of dollars of research. And, the USDA has been great about saying that they're sending money to the Hemp Coalition Way, and researchers are getting funded, but this is just like a painfully slow process. And we are not a big industry that has a bunch of money to fund these things. And so it's not just because I want to pick a fight with regulators that this is happening. Like, this is life or death for many of these industry partners, whether or not they'll be able to survive through the next season. This is life or death for these farmers when they have lots that don't pass, food specifications, and they're sitting on 100 to 200,000 pounds of seed that they don't know what to do with, right? I mean, put yourself in those people's shoes for a second, and maybe you can empathize why they're being so vocal about their frustrations.
Yeah. And like the time frame, decades. I mean, I one of the reasons I'm interested in hemp is, the climate change mitigation, the carbon sequestration. And in that sense, we don't have a lot of time to be messing around with this. And hemp's been shown to be a great sequester of carbon. And so,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at your numbers really quick. Like, I don't know this for a fact, right? But we can look to Canada and we can look how many acres they produce, having this as a food ingredient for the last 20 years. And you can see the growth, like it's growing, but it's pretty small, right? And when you look at the US numbers for acres for planted and harvested grain acres, Montana led the way. The national report just came out. We had 4,500 acres that were harvested. Like, we're not talking
right. It's like nothing, essentially nothing.
Yeah. So it's like, you're absolutely right. If we want to see hemp be considered for climate change and all these other things, the reason we aren't growing a bunch of acres, yes, part of it is because we don't have processing in place, but part of it is because the sales aren't there. No one is mandating that we're planting hundreds of thousands of acres because they need it on their plate or they need it in their feedlot. So I think you're absolutely right. You hit a great point. It's like, if we want to see the change that hemp can do, and fiber varieties, absolutely, that's a big part of it. But equally as a sequestering workhorse are the grain varieties and that seed and the great nutritional impact those genetics can bring.
Yeah. Changing gears a little bit, can you talk about Hemp Feed Coalition's work with Kreider Farms and Chickies Creek hemp eggs?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it was last year you had a great interview with their group there, and for those listeners that may not know, Kreider and Wenger are two Pennsylvania companies that work to bring a hemp-fed chicken and hemp-fed egg to market. And what Raj Kasula, he's actually one of our board members on HFC. He was the principal investigator in that study, and so that study that we took to the application to AAFCO that showed there was no concern. If anything, it was nutritional benefit to have meal in the laying hens diet. He's a part of this whole thing, and they did a fantastic job. They went through kind of another pathway. We kind of were working parallel paths together to get a grass petition forward in front of the Department of Ag in Pennsylvania, which they gave them this temporary status to sell these eggs in Pennsylvania. Obviously, they're limited by the state boundary. But that was a huge victory for the industry and a huge victory for the state of Pennsylvania. I'm so excited that their department was progressive enough to see the opportunity there. But we did work with those groups. I don't know if like everyone in Kreider knew that HFC was a part of that. I was a little disappointed that HFC didn't get a little bit of a shout out there, but that's okay. But that was a great example of how industry and research and associations can work together. Wenger and Kreider paid for the expensive study, which they absolutely should get all the credit for that. But they let us leverage that as well as using our data where we, identified the nutritional components of the 40 different samples that we had from across the country to both of us strengthen our applications to our respective parties. And so that was a great way to get our first application through the door. We're hoping that we find more partners like that. I think that that's a real value. If you talk to Kreider and you talk to them about why they spent their money on that study, it absolutely was a business decision, right? They saw the marketing potential, they saw the nutritional potential. They recognized early on what a hemp-fed egg could potentially do for their business. And so I hope that other people and maybe your listeners could help us get that word out. Is HFC needs more companies like that recognize the value here and take on some of that burden of what it takes to get an application across the finish line. For rough numbers sake, we say it's about $250,000 per application. That's, like I said, it's the study that, for the feed eggs, we had to do a 16-week study at like 5 different inclusion rates of hemp seed meal into the laying hen diet. And so that was in the birds had to be slaughtered, the eggs had to be tested, the meat and the tissue and the blood had to all be tested. So, it's a pretty arduous process and it takes time and money. So I would just encourage listeners to be thinking, like, get your wheels turning about what could this mean for your product or for your company or someone because it requires people to step up to the plate. If they want to ever realize those economic rewards, then they need to do some of the legwork at the front end.
Right. You got to be the change that you want to see in the world, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's coming up for the Hemp Feed Coalition? Any exciting things on the horizon?
Yeah, so we have a couple studies that got completed last year that we're waiting to get publication on. Both of them are ruminant studies. So Colorado State University was looking at hemp seed meal for lambs. That was completed. North Dakota State University was looking at hemp seed meal for cows. We work with Kansas State University. They have a great lab that they do nutrition and toxicity analysis on cannabinoids. So we're trying to get that answer for FDA CBM, right? It's not like we're being ignorant to it. We're working with research groups that are, feeding these cows raw hemp flower, right? Like almost the highest concentration without a distillate or an isolate that these cows would ever eat, and trying to find like, where is the spectrum? Where is there a safety concern? And we haven't found it yet, right? We haven't seen any adverse effects. We don't see like the transference in the cannabinoids in like the meat, milk, and eggs. If we do see it, Oregon State has been working, Dr. Bayanez, it's fantastic. He did a similar study with spent biomass on cattle. And, he was trying to figure out how long did the cannabinoids stay in the animal system. So in case we did use, a pulp material, because, nutritionally, it looks a lot like alfalfa. So when we talk about, this feed shortage we're in right now, think about how many CBD processors out there are sitting on super sacks full of spent biomass.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's just a train wreck almost when you see these, like all these spent, super sack bags that are just full of this highly nutritious product. Oregon especially has that problem. And so, OSU did the study to see how long does it stay in the system. And Dr. Bainez, was able to conclude it, in a 30-day trial. He was able to get he couldn't find cannabinoids in the system anywhere after 30 days. So, I mean, information like that, FDA could easily make a decision of like, okay, well, I'm not sure what the safety is, but let's just say until we come up with a limit that any chicken or cow or lamb or whatever who is eating a hemp ingredient has to be off of that for 30 days before going to slaughter. Right? This is a compromise here while we
Sure.
continue to collect data. I know Dr. Bainez is really excited about that information and wants to try to use that to get, his processors in Oregon some value there too.
Okay.
And we're also working with OSU, speaking of him, we'd like to put together this like workshop with all of these researchers and regulators. And like we talk about, like, let's just get in the same room and let's kind of like hash out some of these questions together. I'm not trying to beat you up, right? Like, we're not going to try to put you in the corner, but I just want you to like, let's have those conversations that take, 10, 20 minutes instead of the 120 days you normally give me a response.
Right. You want to hear what they have to say. They want to hear what you have to say. Just get together and talk.
Yeah. And I think it would be really enlightening for them to like, we have all of this research up on like a slideshow or on a deck, right? And they listen to these researchers who did their studies and they talk about what the results were. And they hear over and over and over again that like, there's no concern, right? And maybe some of that will start to penetrate. But CHTA, like the Canadian Hemp Trade Alliance, they also are working on it their own application, and they're doing their own studies, and they're finding the same thing, right? They're looking at dairy cow, and are there any cannabinoids found in the milk? No, right? So all of these studies are being done. Like, I guess maybe it's my lack of understanding and a little bit of impatience that like these studies are out here. Why do we have to put them in this nice, neat, pretty bow of an application that takes months to do and thousands of dollars to do, instead of just like they can start to collect the information themselves and deduce like as we're learning instead of waiting for everything to be delivered to them on like a silver platter.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Are there other countries around the world that like never stopped feeding hemp grain to their livestock?
So I believe the answer is yes, but I don't know enough to say that like it's approved. I can like probably bet without a shadow of a doubt that there is some farmer in like Poland or something like that, who's been doing it his whole life and never thought any different.
Right.
I don't know if the regulations have always been set up like that because, so many countries just in the last 5 to 10 years have changed their regulations on cannabis products. And so I think feed is kind of the last to the table for a lot of those countries. Okay. So I don't want to, go on record that like, yes, this is been approved or whatnot, but.
Yeah. All right. If people want to learn more about the Hemp Feed Coalition, they want to become a member, they want to make a donation, they can find you at hempfeedcoalition.org.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We really need that help. And I'd give a little shameless plug, for those of you who don't know, like I'm also the chief operating officer of IND Hemp. We're a grain and fiber processor in Montana. And like, that's my day job. And so me being the executive of the Hemp Feed Coalition is great. And I'm super passionate about it and I want it to move forward, but I don't get paid to do this. Like, this isn't my job. This is something I just want to get passionate through, but I could really use some help. So, we approved a salary for an executive assistant, someone who can just like help me get through all of this stuff. And so if there's someone that, has interest in this, like we're just looking for someone who's organized, who has like good communication skills, that they don't have to live here. It can be a remote position.
Oh, okay.
But I think there's a lot of value in someone, if I was a grad student or someone that had, passion in the industry, this could be a great resume builder. To just like, you're seeing the information firsthand, you're talking with regulators. I think it would be a really cool opportunity if you're, young in the industry.
All right. So audience members, there you go. There's your job.
Yeah.
So they
can
tell
me about a lack of jobs out there, right?
Yeah. But you mentioned IND Hemp and, I just have to, for full disclosure reasons, IND Hemp is one of the sponsors of our podcast, but the Hemp Feed Coalition is not. But we here at the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast, we're very excited for the work that you're doing because, I know how meaningful it is, for the hemp industry, for agriculture in general in the U.S. So I appreciate what you're doing, Morgan.
Well, thanks, Eric. We'll get there, just we might be gray haired by the time we get there.
Oh, I'm already getting there. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's always great to talk to you.
Thanks. Talk to you next time.
All right. There you go. So you can learn more about the Hemp Feed Coalition and the work that they're doing at hempfeedcoalition.org. I will put a link to that on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. I will also put a link to the AAFCO's letter so you can read it yourself and see what it's all about. All right. Well, thank you for listening to today's show. I appreciate it. If you ever want to get in touch with me for whatever reason, please do. I love to get email from people. I love to get voicemails from people too. So you can email podcast@lancasterfarming.com, or you can call and leave me a message at 717-721-4462. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. Check us out online at lancasterfarming.com. Get yourself a subscription and we'll deliver the newspaper to your house, right? Anyway, until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper.
Industrial hemp.
This episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2022 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show was written and recorded, edited and produced by Eric Herlock, and any music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow. And then today I'm going to leave you with a little something special. All right, it's that time of year. Peepers and the frogs are making a comeback. So here I'm going to leave you the sound of the local peepers here along the French Creek in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Enjoy.